Admiral William Carter slammed his glass down so hard, the water leaped over the rim and the whole table went quiet. He pointed one thick finger across the ballroom at a plain man in a cheap Navy suit. "You!" he barked loud enough that heads turned. "You don't belong in this room. Men die earning the right to stand where you're standing." The quiet man didn't flinch. He just set down the tray he was carrying and rolled his sleeve back 1 inch, and every officer who saw the mark beneath it stopped breathing, because that mark meant the loudest man in the room owed this stranger his life. Before we go on, drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments so I can see how far this story travels tonight. And if you believe respect should be earned and never assumed, hit that subscribe button and ride with me all the way to the end. You're going to want to see how this one finishes. The invitation had come 3 weeks earlier, and Ethan Walker almost threw it in the trash. It arrived in a heavy cream envelope with a gold Navy seal pressed into the corner, the kind of envelope that cost more than the boots he'd worn through 2 deployments. His name was written across the front in careful ink. Mr. Ethan Walker. Not petty officer, not chief, not any of the things he used to be. Just a Mr. now like every other tired man who pushed a grocery cart on Saturday mornings and fell asleep in a recliner by 9. He'd stood in his kitchen, holding it for a long time. "What's that, Dad?" Lily was 7 all elbows and questions, her dark hair still messy from sleep. She climbed onto the stool at the counter and looked up at him with the same steady eyes her mother used to have. Sometimes it stopped his heart a little how much of Sarah lived in that face. "It's nothing, baby. Junk mail. It's got a gold thing on it. Junk mail doesn't have gold things." He almost smiled. Nothing got past her. That was the problem with raising a sharp kid alone. You couldn't lie to save your own feelings. "It's from some old Navy folks. They're having a fancy dinner." "Are you going?" "No." "Why not?" "Because I don't do that stuff anymore." Lily considered this with the seriousness of a small judge. "Is it because you don't have a nice suit?" "Because Mrs. Delgado said you can borrow Mr. Delgado's suit. She told me at the fence." Ethan let out a slow breath. That was the neighborhood for you. Everybody knew everybody's business, and everybody meant well, and none of them had the first idea who the quiet man in the corner house used to be. To them, he was the guy who mowed the strip by the sidewalk without being asked. The one who fixed the Hendersons' fence after the storm and wouldn't take a dime. The single dad with the polite little girl who always said please and thank you. That was fine. That was exactly how he wanted it. He set the envelope on top of the refrigerator out of Lily's reach and out of his own line of sight and figured that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 2 nights later, the phone rang. A number he didn't recognize, area code from a place he hadn't lived in 15 years. He almost let it go to voicemail. Something made him pick up. "Walker." His voice came out flat and careful. Old habits. There was a pause on the line and then a voice he never expected to hear again. Older now, rougher, but unmistakable. "So it is you. I wasn't sure they'd found the right man." Ethan's grip tightened on the phone. He walked slowly toward the window, away from the hallway where Lily was brushing her teeth. "Master Chief," he said quietly. "Retired now. Been retired a long time. But you can still call me that if it makes you feel young." A dry chuckle. "How are you, son?" "I'm all right." A beat. "How'd you get this number?" "I'm an old man with too much time and too many favors owed to me. Getting a phone number is nothing." The voice softened. "I heard about Sarah. I'm sorry. I truly am. She was a fine woman." Ethan closed his eyes. 3 years, and it still landed like a fist under the ribs every time someone said her name. "Thank you," he managed. "You raising the girl alone?" "Yes, sir." "Good. That's the most important mission you'll ever run. You remember that." The old man cleared his throat. "But that's not why I called. You get an invitation." Ethan's eyes drifted toward the top of the refrigerator. "I did." "And you're not planning to come?" "No, sir." "Why not?" He almost laughed. Same question his daughter had asked, and he had no better answer for a decorated Master Chief than he'd had for a 7-year-old. Because that part of my life is over. I don't need a room full of medals and speeches reminding me of things I've spent a lot of years trying to forget. The line was quiet for a moment. When the old man spoke again, his voice had changed. Not soft anymore, serious. The voice he used to use before a briefing when the room went still and every man leaned in. Ethan, listen to me. I didn't put your name on that list to give you a plaque. I put it there because there's a debt in that room that's never been paid, and I'm old and I'm tired, and I want to see it settled before I'm gone. You understand me? I don't want anything settled. I did my job. I went home. That's the end of it. It's not the end of it for the men who lived because of what you did. It's never been the end of it for them. Some of those men have carried your name around for years without a face to put to it. They deserve to see the face. A pause. And so do you. Ethan didn't answer. You still there? I'm here. Come to the dinner. Wear whatever you want. Stand in the back if it makes you comfortable. Say nothing to nobody. Just come. Do it for an old man who's asking you a favor he's never asked before. Down the hall, the bathroom light clicked off. Small footsteps padded toward a bedroom. A little voice called out, Dad, are you going to read me the chapter? In a minute, baby, he called back. Then into the phone quieter. I've got a kid to look after. I can't just bring somebody to watch her for one night. You've got neighbors. You've got the Delgados. The old man knew too much. He always had. One night, Ethan. That's all I'm asking. And Ethan Walker, who had said no to generals, who had said no to reporters, who had said no to men with far more power and far less patience, found that he could not say no to this one tired voice from the past. I'll think about it, he said. That's a yes, the old man said, and hung up before Ethan could argue. He thought about it for a week. He thought about it while he made Lily's lunches, and while he fixed the leaking faucet in the guest bathroom, and while he sat in the truck outside her school waiting for the bell. He thought about it at 2 a.m. when he couldn't sleep, which was most nights, staring at the ceiling of the room he used to share with Sarah, the mattress still dipping toward the side that was empty now. He thought about the men. That was what got him in the end. Not the debt the old man talked about. Ethan didn't believe in debts like that, didn't believe anybody owed him a single thing for doing what any decent man would have done. But he thought about the men. The ones who'd been down there in the dark, and the dust with their radios dead, and their ammunition running low, and no way out. He thought about how it must have felt believing you were about to die, and then watching the thing that was going to kill you simply fall apart around you for reasons you couldn't understand. He knew what that felt like. To be certain you were finished, and then find out you weren't. It stayed with a man. It changed the shape of him. And the old Master Chief was right about one thing. If those men wanted to see his face, if it would give even one of them some kind of peace, then maybe he owed them that much. Not a debt, just a decency. So on a Thursday morning, he told Lily he had to go away for one night. Where? San Diego. Just for the dinner. Mrs. Delgado's going to stay here with you. Lily's face did a complicated thing, part excitement at the novelty and part worry at the change in routine. Are you going to wear the borrowed suit? I'm going to wear my own suit. You have a suit. I have one suit. Is it nice? Ethan crouched down so he was eye level with her. It's clean and it fits. That's all a suit needs to be. Lily reached out and put her small hand flat against his cheek, the way she did sometimes when she was about to say something that would knock the wind out of him. You'll be the handsomest one there, she said with total conviction. He had to look away for a second. Thanks, baby. Are there going to be important people? Some important people, I guess. Are you important? He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up and ruffled her hair and picked up the coffee cup he'd left on the counter. The only important thing I ever did, he said, is right here in this kitchen asking me questions. She grinned at that, satisfied, and went back to her cereal, and never knew how close her father came in that moment to sitting down on the kitchen floor and not getting up. The suit was 15 years old, and it still fit because Ethan Walker was still at 44, built the way the Navy had built him. Lean, hard, nothing wasted. He stood in front of the mirror in the motel room he'd booked 20 minutes from the venue and looked at a man he barely recognized. The suit was plain. Dark navy, single-breasted, no flag pin, no ribbon, nothing on it at all. He'd left the tie a little loose because a tight collar still made him feel like something was closing around his throat. His forearms were covered, long sleeves buttoned at the cuff. That was on purpose too. He drove to the venue with the radio off and his window cracked the way he always drove, listening to the sound of the road and the city and letting his mind go flat and quiet the way it used to before an operation. Except this wasn't an operation. This was a dinner. He had to keep reminding himself of that. Just a dinner. Walk in, stand in the back, let the old man see he'd come, shake a couple of hands if he had to, and be back in the truck before 10. The venue was one of those grand old waterfront halls, all polished floors and chandeliers, and men in dress uniforms so crisp they looked painted on. Ethan felt the difference the moment he walked through the doors. It came off the room like heat off asphalt, the particular density of a place full of important people who all knew exactly how important they were. Rank hung in the air like cologne. You could smell it. He gave his name at the door to a young officer with a clipboard. "Walker," he said. "Ethan Walker." The kid ran his finger down the list frowning, and Ethan watched him do it. Watched him get to the W's and slow down and read the entry twice, and glance up with a look Ethan couldn't quite read, something between confusion and disbelief. Then the kid caught himself straightened and said, "Yes, sir, you're on the list. Right through there, sir." The "sir" came out strange. Too fast, too crisp, like the kid's body had responded to something before his brain caught up. Ethan nodded and went in. Nobody else looked at him twice. That was the thing about a room like that. Everybody was reading everybody else constantly, instinctively reading the shoulder boards and the ribbon racks, and the way a man carried himself, and a plain fellow in a plain suit with nothing to read simply slid beneath notice. He was furniture. He was a caterer maybe, or somebody's driver, or a mid-level bureaucrat from the base who'd wandered in from the parking authority. He was nobody, and nobody was exactly what he'd come here to be. He found a spot near the back wall, next to a table with a water pitcher on it, and he stood there with his hands folded in front of him and his back to the wall again. On purpose, a habit 15 years couldn't kill, and he watched the room the way he'd once watched everything. Not nervous, just aware, cataloging exits and faces and the shape of the crowd. That was how he first saw Admiral William Carter. You couldn't miss him. Carter was the kind of man rooms rearranged themselves around. Big through the chest and shoulders, silver hair cut close to the skull, a jaw like a cinder block. His dress uniform carried more decorations than any 3 other men in the hall, and he wore them the way some men wear money, not with pride exactly, but with the flat certainty of someone who's never once been made to feel small. Officers orbited him. They laughed a half-second before his jokes landed. They refilled his glass before it was empty. When he spoke, the men around him leaned in like flowers turning toward a window. Ethan watched him for a while, the way you'd watch weather. He didn't recognize the name Carter, not right away. 15 years and 100 operations blurred a lot of names together, but there was something about the man's face, something in the set of the eyes that scratched at a locked door in the back of his memory. He couldn't place it. He let it go. That was another thing the job had taught him: don't chase a thought that won't come. It'll come on its own, or it won't come at all. He got himself a glass of water from the pitcher. It gave his hands something to do, and he was halfway through it when Admiral Carter's attention swung across the room and landed on him like a searchlight. Ethan felt it before he saw it. The particular weight of a man deciding you were a problem. Carter had been mid-sentence holding court with a knot of younger officers, and something about the plain man standing alone by the wall had snagged his eye and offended some deep instinct in him. Ethan could read it plain as print. Who's that? Why's he standing like that? Why doesn't he look impressed? Men like Carter needed the room to reflect them back at themselves, and Ethan wasn't reflecting anything. The Admiral broke away from his circle and walked over. He didn't hurry. Men like him never hurried. The crowd made a path without being asked. He stopped a few feet away and looked Ethan up and down, slow, deliberate, the way you'd size up a used truck you had no intention of buying. "I don't believe we've met," Carter said. It wasn't friendly. It was a challenge dressed up as a greeting. "No, sir," Ethan said. "We haven't. You attached to the base logistics contracting." A small, cold smile. "You've got the look of a man who signs off on invoices." A couple of the officers who'd trailed him over chuckled quietly. "No, sir," Ethan said. "I'm not with the base." "Then what's your business here?" "I was invited." Carter's eyebrow went up a fraction. "Invited." He said the word the way you'd hold up a dead mouse by the tail. "By whom?" "An old friend." "An old friend?" The Admiral's eyes flicked over the plain suit, the empty lapel, the loose tie, and Ethan watched the man do the math and arrive with total confidence at the wrong answer. "You served—" "I did." "In what capacity?" Ethan considered his words. He'd promised the old man he'd come. He hadn't promised he'd explain himself to anyone. "Special operations," he said quietly. "A long time ago." The word dropped into the little cluster of men like a stone into a pond, and Ethan watched the ripples. A couple of the younger officers straightened up uncertain, but Admiral Carter just laughed. It wasn't a small laugh. It came up from his chest, loud and genuine and cruel, and it turned heads. He laughed the way a man laughs when he's spent his whole life being the biggest thing in the room and has forgotten that the world contains anything he hasn't already measured. "You," Carter said when he'd recovered enough to speak. "Special operations." "Yes, sir." "Son, I've spent 30 years around special operators. Real ones. Men who could tear this room apart with their bare hands." He gestured at Ethan with his glass, a lazy, dismissive sweep. "You want to know what a special operator looks like? He doesn't look like you. You look like a man who fixes the equipment. You look like the fella who tunes up the radios and hands the real warriors their gear and goes home to the suburbs." He turned to his circle, playing to the crowd now, and his voice rose. "No offense, friend, but there's a difference between the men who serve the mission and the men who are the mission. And I've been doing this long enough to tell one from the other with my eyes closed." The laughter around him swelled. More heads turned. Ethan felt the attention of the room settling on him now. Dozens of eyes, the whole social weight of the place tilting his way, and it was exactly what he'd come here hoping to avoid. He didn't rise to it. That was the thing Carter and every man like him could never understand, that not rising to it wasn't weakness. It was the opposite. Ethan had learned a long time ago, lying in the cold for 11 hours, with his eye pressed to a scope and his heartbeat slowed to almost nothing, that the strongest thing a man could do was very often nothing at all. To wait, to hold, to let the loud men be loud. "You might be right, sir," he said evenly. That threw Carter for half a second. He'd been braced for an argument, some sputtering defense, the kind of thing that would have let him land the killing blow in front of an audience. He hadn't expected agreement. It took the wind out of the moment, and the Admiral covered the loss the way big men do by getting bigger. "Of course I'm right," Carter said. "I'm always right. That's why they gave me this." He tapped the stars on his shoulder. "You know how many men would give an arm to stand where I'm standing. You know what it costs to earn this." He leaned in a little, dropping his voice to something that was almost gentle and was actually worse than shouting. "I've buried men who were better than you'll ever be, friend. So do us both a favor. Enjoy the free dinner, keep to the back, and don't go telling people you were something you weren't. There's men in this room who earned the right to that word. And you're standing on their graves every time you use it." The silence that followed had teeth in it. Ethan looked at him for a long moment, and in that moment, something in Carter's face, the anger, the certainty, the particular way the muscle worked in his jaw when he was daring you to swing at him, that scratching at the locked door in the back of Ethan's memory, suddenly turned into a key. He knew that face. Not the silver hair, not the stars. Younger, filthy, streaked with sweat and blood and terror. A face he'd seen exactly once for less than 4 seconds through a spotting scope from 900 meters away in the worst 4 minutes of a night that Ethan Walker had spent 15 years trying to forget. Operation Silent Harbor. The name came up out of the dark like a body surfacing in water, and Ethan felt the floor of the ballroom tilt very slightly beneath his feet. He kept his expression flat. 15 years of training held. But something must have flickered some small change because Carter narrowed his eyes. "Something funny?" the Admiral demanded. "No, sir," Ethan said. "Nothing funny." But he was thinking, "I know why your voice does that. I know why your hands shake a little when you get angry, even now, even here in a room full of chandeliers. I know what happened to you in the dark. I know it because I'm the reason you walked out of it." And Carter had no idea. Of course he had no idea. To Carter, Ethan was just a nobody in a cheap suit, an insult that had wandered into his ceremony, a man to be put in his place. He couldn't have known that the last time these two men had occupied the same patch of earth, one of them had been dying, and the other had reached out across 900 meters of darkness and pulled him back from it. "Good," Carter said, mistaking Ethan's silence for surrender. "Then we understand each other." He straightened, turned to his circle, and delivered the exit line he'd clearly been saving. "Come on, gentlemen, let's go find some company worth keeping." And he walked away, and his officers followed, and the laughter trailed after them like the wake behind a boat, and the room slowly, mercifully turned its attention back to itself. Ethan stood alone against the wall with his glass of water and let his heartbeat come back down. Silent Harbor. He hadn't said that name out loud in 15 years. Hadn't let himself think it in almost as long, not straight on, not in daylight. It lived in the part of his mind he kept sealed along with the sound the radio made when it went dead, and the particular weight of the rifle against his shoulder, and the thing he'd carried home from that night, that no metal could ever have touched. He remembered the ridge. He remembered the cold. He remembered his spotter's voice in his ear, calm and dry, feeding him corrections, while a team of Americans died by inches in the valley below. He remembered the exact moment the decision came to him. Not a decision really, more like a door opening. The moment when 11 hours of stillness collapsed into 4 minutes of the most violent, precise work he had ever done. He remembered the young captain most of all. The one who'd been standing when everyone else was down, the one dragging a wounded man by his collar and firing his sidearm at shapes in the dark. The one who by every measure should have died in the next 10 seconds and somehow didn't, because a stranger 900 meters away had decided he wouldn't. That captain had a face. Ethan had just watched that face laugh at him across a ballroom. He set his water glass down very carefully on the table beside him because his hand wasn't quite steady, and that annoyed him. He'd held a rifle rock still through worse than this. But that was different. That was work. This was something else. This was the strange, sick vertigo of the past reaching up through the floor of the present and grabbing him by the ankle. He thought about Lily. He thought about the promise he'd made himself the day Sarah died, that he was done with all of it. Done with being Shadow, done with the man he used to be. That from here on out, he was just a father and nothing else. He thought about how easy it would be to walk out those doors right now, get in the truck, drive home, kiss his sleeping daughter on the forehead, and let this whole strange night dissolve like a dream. Nobody would stop him. Nobody would even notice him go. That was the whole point of being nobody. He turned toward the exit, and that was when the old Master Chief found him. He came out of the crowd slower than Ethan remembered, leaning on a cane he hadn't had 15 years ago. His hair gone completely white. His face folded up with age like a map that's been opened and refolded 1,000 times. But the eyes were the same, sharp, steady. The eyes of a man who'd spent his whole life seeing exactly what was in front of him. He stopped a few feet away and looked Ethan up and down, and unlike Carter, he didn't laugh. "There he is," the old man said quietly. Shadow himself. Ethan felt something move in his chest at the name. "Master Chief? You came." There was something in the old man's voice that wasn't quite steady either. "I wasn't sure you would. I'm glad I was wrong." He glanced toward the exit Ethan had been walking toward, then back at his face, and he read the whole thing in a second, the way he'd always been able to read men. You were leaving. I was thinking about it. Why? Ethan glanced across the room to where Admiral Carter stood, in the center of a laughing circle, big and bright and untouchable. The old man followed his gaze. Understanding moved across his face like a cloud. Ah, the old man said softly. He got to you. He didn't get to me. Son, I've known you 15 years. I can see when a man's been got to. He shifted his weight on the cane and looked toward Carter with an expression Ethan couldn't quite name. Something old. Something patient. You know who that is? I figured it out about a minute ago. The old man nodded slowly. He doesn't know you, does he? No. He was mocking you. Just now. I saw it from across the room. The old man's jaw tightened. The man you saved. Laughing in your face. He didn't know. That's not the point, and you know it isn't. The old man's voice dropped low and hard. The briefing voice, the voice that had sent men into the worst nights of their lives and brought most of them home. Ethan, listen to me. That man out there has spent 15 years telling everyone who will listen about the night his team got out of Silent Harbor. He tells it at every dinner. He tells it to recruits. He's built half his legend on it. And in every single version of that story, there's a mystery. There's a ghost. There's a shot that came out of nowhere and saved 12 American lives, and to this day, he doesn't know who took it. The old man leaned closer. He's spent 15 years looking for you, and tonight, he laughed in your face and told you you weren't good enough to say the word operator in his presence. Ethan said nothing. I brought you here for a reason, the old man went on, and it wasn't so you could stand in the back and slip out early. There's a recognition tonight. Later, after the speeches, they're finally declassifying part of what happened at Silent Harbor. They're finally going to say the name out loud. Your name. He watched Ethan's face carefully. I fought for that for 10 years. I filed the paperwork. I made the calls. I called in every favor an old man had left because those 12 men, they deserve to know who saved them. And you deserve to stop being a ghost. I know what you don't want. The old man's voice gentled. You don't want the attention. You never did. That's what made you the best I ever saw. But this isn't about what you want, son. This is about the truth. And the truth is that in about an hour, a man who called you a nobody is going to find out he owes you his life. And he's going to have to stand in this room in front of everyone he's ever tried to impress and reckon with it. The old man's eyes glittered. You can leave now if you want. I won't stop you, but I think you should stay. Not for the medal. Not for the pride. Stay because some debts have to be seen to be paid. And this one's been hiding in the dark for 15 years. Across the room, Admiral William Carter threw his head back and laughed at something loud and confident, the sound carrying over the murmur of the crowd, utterly unaware that the plain man he'd humiliated 10 minutes ago held the one thing his whole legend had been missing. Ethan looked at him for a long time. Then he looked down at his own forearm, at the cuff, buttoned tight over the thing he'd kept covered for 15 years, the mark that only a handful of men on Earth had ever earned, the mark that would tell every operator in this room exactly who he was the second they saw it. He thought about Lily saying, "You'll be the handsomest one there." He thought about Sarah, who'd known everything and had loved him anyway, and had made him promise at the end not to disappear so far into his quiet life that he forgot he'd ever done anything worth remembering. Don't you hide from it, she'd told him. What you did mattered. Don't you dare let it become something you're ashamed of just because it's easier. He let out a slow breath. How long? He said quietly. Until they call the name. The old Master Chief smiled for the first time all night. It took years off his face. Long enough for you to get yourself a real drink, he said, and short enough that you won't have time to change your mind. Ethan almost smiled back. Almost. I'll stay, he said, and somewhere across that bright, loud, crowded room, unaware that the ground had just shifted beneath his polished shoes, Admiral William Carter raised his glass to a toast. The last toast he would ever make, before the night taught him the difference between the men who wear their glory on their chests and the men who carry it in silence beneath a buttoned sleeve. The old Master Chief melted back into the crowd, the way old operators do there 1 second and gone the next. And Ethan Walker was left standing against the wall with a name in his chest that he hadn't let himself say in 15 years. Silent Harbor. He turned the glass of water slowly in his hand and told himself to breathe, and while he breathed, the past came up around him like water filling a low room. It hadn't started as a rescue. That was the thing people never understood about that night. The thing Carter's polished dinner table version always left out. It had started as an overwatch job. Routine, or as routine as anything got out there. A 12-man team was going in to grab a high-value target from a compound near the water, and somebody up the chain had wanted a set of eyes on the high ground in case things went sideways. So they'd sent Ethan and his spotter up a ridge in the dark, told them to lie still, watch the approach, and shoot only if the world came apart. The world came apart. You're chewing on it. A voice said, dry and close, and for one disorienting second, Ethan was back on that ridge with his spotter's breath fogging in the cold beside him. Then he blinked, and it was the present again, and it was only a passing waiter offering to take his empty glass. Ethan handed it over without a word, and the young man moved on, and Ethan pressed his back a little harder against the wall, because his hands wanted something to do, and there was nothing left to hold. His spotter's name had been Danny Reyes, 26 years old from a town outside El Paso, a kid who could do trigonometry in his head faster than most men could load a magazine. He'd talked the whole way up the ridge quiet and constant, the way he always did about his girl back home and the ring he was saving for, and the diner his uncle ran where the green chili would take the roof off your mouth. Ethan had let him talk. You let a man talk on the way in. You never let him talk on the way out because on the way out, you didn't know yet if there'd be a way out at all. They'd been in position 11 hours when the radio down in the valley started to scream. Ethan remembered the exact sound of it. Not words at first, just noise, the particular electric chaos of men who were being killed. Then a voice cutting through ragged, too fast, the transmission discipline gone to pieces, because discipline is the first thing that dies when men start dying. Contact, contact. We are surrounded. We have wounded we need. And then nothing. A hiss of static, and Danny's hand had gripped his shoulder hard enough to bruise. Ethan. Danny's voice flat now, all the chatter burned out of it. Ethan, they're getting cut off. He'd already had his eye on the scope. He'd already seen it. Down in the compound, the neat plan had come apart into a nightmare. The team had walked into more than anyone briefed them for. Muzzle flashes bloomed in the dark from 3 sides, and in the middle of it, Ethan could see the shapes of American men trying to consolidate, trying to pull their wounded into cover, and losing ground with every second. "Air's 20 minutes out," Danny said. His voice cracked on the number. They don't have 20 minutes. They didn't have 5. And here was the thing nobody at a dinner table ever heard, the thing Ethan had carried alone for 15 years. He had hesitated, for maybe 3 seconds. 3 seconds that had stretched into something enormous and terrible. Ethan Walker had lain on that ridge and done the math that no man should ever have to do. Because the moment he fired, he gave away his position. The moment he fired, he and Danny went from ghosts to targets, and there were enough enemy fighters down in that valley to come up the ridge and finish 2 men in the dark before any help arrived. He had a wife at home. He had just found out in a letter 3 weeks old writing in his chest pocket that the wife was going to make him a father. And every instinct that had kept him alive through a career of impossible nights was screaming at him to stay still, stay silent, stay a ghost. Ethan? Danny's voice again, and Ethan had turned his head 1 inch and seen the kid looking at him, and he would never forget the look on that boy's face as long as he lived. It wasn't fear. It was worse than fear. It was a question. It was Danny Reyes asking without words what kind of men they were going to turn out to be. Ethan had put his eye back to the scope. "Give me a wind call," he'd said, and his voice had come out of him calm and dead level. The voice he didn't recognize as his own. The voice that only showed up when everything else went quiet. And Danny, whatever happens after this, you did good work tonight. Don't, Danny had said, already reaching for his gear, already knowing what firing meant for both of them. Don't say goodbye stuff, just shoot. So he shot. Back in the ballroom, 15 years and 9,000 miles away, Ethan realized his jaw was clenched hard enough to ache. He made himself unclench it. He made himself look at the room. The chandeliers, the laughing officers, the polished floor, and pull himself back up into the present, out of that cold, dark valley he'd fallen into. But it was hard. It was always hard. That was why he never let himself go down there. Once you started remembering, the memory didn't care about the chandeliers. A hand touched his elbow, and Ethan turned, and it was a woman he didn't know in a navy dress uniform, with a commander's insignia, holding 2 glasses. She held one out to him. "You looked like you could use this more than the champagne," she said. "It's just club soda. I'm on the recognition committee. I'm not supposed to drink till after." Ethan took it because refusing would have drawn more attention than accepting. "Thank you. You're him," the commander said quietly. Not a question. Her eyes were bright and careful. "Aren't you? The one they're honoring tonight. I've read the file, or the parts of it that aren't blacked out, which isn't much." She glanced around, lowered her voice further. "My father was on that team, Mr. Walker. Down in that valley. He came home and I got to grow up with a father because of what you did on that ridge. I needed to say that to you before it all happens up there on the stage, in case I don't get another chance to say it plain." And that landed somewhere deep. Somewhere Ethan kept armored, and for a second he couldn't answer her at all. He looked at this woman grown in uniform standing here because a man he'd never met had walked out of a valley alive, and he understood, in a way he hadn't fully let himself understand before, what the old Master Chief had meant about debts that have to be seen. "What's his name?" Ethan said finally. "Your father, Ramirez, Staff Sergeant. He'd want you to know he made Master Gunny before he retired. He'd want you to know he did all right." Her voice wobbled, and she got it back under control, the way people in uniform learn to do. "He passed 2 years ago. Cancer. But he talked about that night every year. Every single year on the date. He'd get quiet and pour a drink and say a prayer for the ghost on the ridge who never got a name." She smiled, though her eyes were wet. "And now the ghost has a name. And I get to be in the room. So, thank you. That's all. I'll leave you be." She squeezed his elbow once and slipped away before he could find any words worth giving her, and Ethan stood there holding a glass of club soda and feeling 15 years of careful distance crack straight down the middle. He had not fired 1 shot that night. He had fired 11. The first had taken the machine gunner on the eastern wall, the one who had the team pinned, and Ethan had felt the recoil settle into his shoulder and heard Danny say, "Hit," in that flat professional way, and then there had been no more time to feel anything at all. The second shot, the third, the fourth. Danny reading targets, calling wind, calling range, the 2 of them working like one machine, and down in the valley, the impossible thing had started to happen. The enemy fire, which had been coming from 3 coordinated sides, began to break apart. Because that was what a good shooter on the high ground did to men. He made them afraid of the sky. He made them stop thinking about the 12 Americans in the low ground and start thinking about the death that was arriving from nowhere, 1 man at a time, silent and sourceless. Ethan couldn't hear the crack of his own rifle reach them across that distance, but he could see what it did. He could see fighters break from cover and run and fall. He could see the whole shape of the ambush lose its nerve. And he could see 1 American 1 man down there who, instead of running for the gap Ethan was opening, had turned around and gone back. That was Carter. Ethan hadn't known his name then. He'd just been a shape in the scope, a shape that should have been saving itself, and was instead dragging a wounded man by the drag handle on his vest. Backward one-handed, firing a pistol into the dark, with the other hand at targets he couldn't possibly hit. Ethan had watched that shape refuse to leave a man behind, while the whole world came apart around him. And some part of Ethan that stayed cold and clear, even in the worst of it, had thought with something like respect, "That's a good one. Keep that one alive." So he'd kept him alive. He'd put 3 rounds into 3 men who were closing on that stubborn shape in the dark, one after another. Click and breathe and squeeze, and he'd cleared a path, and the shape had made it to cover with the wounded man still breathing. And then the helicopters had finally come in loud and low over the ridge, and it was over. 11 shots, 11 men, 4 minutes. And the price of it? Ethan came all the way back to the present now, because this was the part he could not stay near for long. The price of it had come up the ridge in the last 30 seconds, exactly the way his instincts had warned him it would. A handful of fighters cut off from the collapsing ambush had figured out where the death was coming from and climbed toward it. Ethan and Danny had heard them before they saw them boots on scree, and there had been a scramble in the dark, and Ethan had gotten his sidearm up, and Danny had gotten his rifle around, and the two of them had fought in the black for their lives, with the helicopters roaring in the valley below, drowning out everything. They'd won. But Danny Reyes had taken a round low in the side in the last 10 seconds of it, and by the time Ethan got him down the ridge and got the Korsman on him, the kid from El Paso with the ring saved up, and the uncle's diner, and the girl back home, had gone gray and quiet in Ethan's arms. "Tell her," Danny had said, and that was all he'd gotten out. And Ethan never did find out how that sentence was supposed to end, and it had haunted him for 15 years. Tell her what? He'd gone to see the girl when he got home. He'd sat in her mother's living room with his hat in his hands and told her that Danny had been brave, and that Danny had loved her, and that the last thing on the boy's mind had been her, and it might even have been true, and it hadn't been enough, and it never would be. That was Silent Harbor. That was what the ghost on the ridge had actually done, and actually paid underneath the clean legend that Admiral William Carter told at dinner tables to make himself sound like the hero of a night he'd survived, because somebody else was better than him in the dark. Ethan set the club soda down. He didn't do it in anger. He wasn't an angry man. The job had burned most of that out of him a long time ago, and Lily had burned out the rest. But something had settled in him during those few minutes of remembering something hard and clear. He'd come here tonight ready to slip in and slip out, ready to let the old man see his face, and then vanish back into his quiet life. He'd even been ready 10 minutes ago to let Carter's mockery slide off him and walk out those doors and never think about any of it again. He wasn't ready for that anymore. Not because of pride, because of Danny, because of Ramirez. Because of a grown woman in a commander's uniform who'd waited 2 years and crossed a ballroom to say thank you to a ghost. Because the men who'd died, and the men who'd lived, and the daughters who got to grow up with fathers, all deserved better than a version of that night with the truth cut out of it, and a big loud man's face stamped over the top. "You're still here," the old Master Chief said, appearing at his side again with his cane and his white hair and his knowing eyes. "Good. I was worried you'd talk yourself out of it." "I almost did." "What changed your mind?" Ethan looked at him. "A commander named Ramirez. Her father was on the team." The old man's face did something complicated. "Sergeant Ramirez's girl. She's here." He shook his head slowly. 15 years. You've got no idea, do you, how far the thing you did that night traveled. You put one stone in the water, and it's still making rings you'll never see the edge of." He tapped the floor with his cane. "That's why I fought for this. 10 years of paperwork, son. You want to know how many times they told me no? How many? Enough that I stopped counting and started getting stubborn." A dry smile. "Turns out a stubborn old Master Chief is harder to kill than a young man's patience. They finally caved last spring. Partial D-class. Enough to say your name in a room and pin something on your chest if you'd let them, which I know you won't." He studied Ethan. "You don't have to make a speech. You don't have to say a word if you don't want to. You just have to be standing here when they call it. Can you do that?" "I can do that." "Then do me one more favor while we wait." The old man's eyes cut across the room toward the bright center of the crowd, toward the silver head and the cinder-block jaw. "Go get yourself something to eat and stay out of that man's way. Because I know you. And I know that 15 years of you not being an angry man does not mean there's no anger in you. It just means it's patient. And Bill Carter has a gift for finding the exact soft spot in a man and pressing on it till something gives." But it was already too late for that advice because Admiral William Carter had spotted them. He came across the floor with two of his officers in tow, and that same rolling, unhurried gait, and his eyes were fixed not on Ethan now, but on the old Master Chief, and his face had lit up with a warmth that made Ethan's skin crawl precisely because it was genuine. "Sailor," Carter boomed, and there was real affection in it. "They dragged you out of retirement for this. I thought you were dead, or worse, living in Florida." "Not dead yet, Bill," the old man said mildly. "Give it time." Carter laughed and clapped him on the shoulder, and then his eyes slid sideways to Ethan, and the warmth cooled about 40 degrees. "You know this fella?" "He's been standing in the corner all night looking like he lost his invitation to the actual party. Told me he was special operations." Carter's grin turned sharp. "I set him straight." The old man was quiet for a beat. Ethan watched him decide something. "Did you?" the old Master Chief said. "Somebody has to. Can't have every base contractor and radio fixer in the county wandering into a room like this and calling himself an operator. Waters down the word. Disrespects the men who earned it." Carter said it easily, comfortably, a man restating a self-evident truth. "You of all people know that. How many funerals did the two of us stand at back in the day?" "A few," the old man agreed. And then, in a voice so even and so pleasant that Ethan almost missed the blade in it. "Bill, do you remember Silent Harbor?" The change in Carter was small, but it was there. Ethan saw it because Ethan saw everything. A tightening at the corners of the eyes. A half-beat pause before the easy answer. "Course I remember Silent Harbor. I tell that story every chance I get. Best night of my career, and the worst all rolled into one." He shook his head, the practiced sorrow settling over his face like a coat he'd worn 1,000 times. "Lost good men that night. But we got the rest out. 12 of us walked into that valley and well, you know how it went." "Tell me how it went," the old man said. Carter blinked a little, thrown by the request, but a man like Carter never turned down an invitation to tell his best story. "We got surrounded. Ambushed 3 sides, more of them than the intel said, by a factor of 4. Comms went down. Air was too far out. We were—" He spread his hands. "We were finished. Dead men still standing. And then—" He paused for effect. He'd told it enough to know where the pauses went. Then somebody up on the high ground started thinning them out, one shot at a time. Whoever it was, he was a machine. Impossible shots in the dark and the wind, and every one of them found a man who was about to punch my ticket. Cleared us a lane, kept us alive long enough for the birds to get in." Carter's voice dropped, and for just a moment the performance fell away, and something real showed underneath something that had been sitting in the man for 15 years. "I never found out who it was. Nobody would tell me. Classified, they said. Above your pay grade, they said." He shook his head slowly. "I've spent 15 years wanting to shake that man's hand, whoever he was. He's the reason I got to go home. He's the reason I got to be an admiral. He's the reason I got to do a damn thing with my life at all. And I never got to say thank you." The room around them had thinned. The officers had drifted. It was just the 3 of them now, in a little pocket of quiet, and Ethan stood there and listened to the man who'd called him a radio fixer describe with genuine grief in his voice the debt he owed to a ghost he'd been laughing at 10 minutes ago. The old Master Chief looked at Carter for a long, long moment, and then he did something Ethan hadn't expected. He didn't say it. He didn't point. He didn't hand Carter the truth on a plate the way part of Ethan had almost hoped he would, just to watch the big man's face come apart. The old man just nodded slowly and said very quietly, "You'll get your chance to say thank you, Bill. Sooner than you think." Carter frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means stick around for the recognition. Don't slip out early to go find the good bourbon. I have a feeling tonight's going to answer a question you've been carrying a long time." The old man tapped his cane once against the floor, a small punctuation. "Now, if you'll excuse us, my friend and I have some catching up to do." And he steered Ethan away by the elbow, leaving Admiral William Carter standing in the middle of the floor, with a puzzled crease between his silver brows and the ghost of his own story still hanging in the air around him. When they were far enough away, Ethan let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. "You could have told him." "I could have." "Why didn't you?" The old man's eyes glittered. "Because a truth like that shouldn't be handed to a man. It should be dropped on him from a height, so it lands hard enough to change him." He glanced back over his shoulder at Carter. "Bill Carter's a good man buried under 30 years of being the biggest thing in every room he walks into. He earned some of that. But somewhere along the way, he forgot that the biggest thing in the room is usually the loudest, and the loudest is almost never the strongest. He's about to get reminded. In front of everyone he's ever tried to impress." A grim little smile. "I've waited 15 years to watch that man learn some humility. I'm not going to rush it now." Ethan almost smiled, and then his phone buzzed in his jacket pocket, and every other thought fell out of his head, because the only person who ever texted him this time of night was the one person in the world who mattered more than any of this. It was the Delgado's number, Mrs. Delgado texting for Lily, who was too young for her own phone. The message read, "She won't sleep. Says she needs to talk to her dad. Is that okay?" Ethan was already dialing. "Everything all right?" the old man asked, reading his face. "My daughter." He turned away and put the phone to his ear, and the ballroom and the chandeliers, and Admiral Carter all fell away, and when Lily's small voice came on the line, "Daddy," the whole hard, clear night went soft in his chest. "Hey, baby, what's the matter? You should be asleep. I had a bad feeling." Lily's voice was thick the way it got when she'd been crying and was trying not to. "In my stomach, like when you left and didn't come back one time." Ethan closed his eyes. She was talking about a deployment. She'd been too young to remember a thing she couldn't possibly have a real memory of, and yet somehow the fear of it lived in her anyway, passed down in the blood, the way his own steadiness had been passed down from his own father. "Baby, I'm at a dinner. I'm in a big fancy room with a bunch of old sailors. Nobody's shooting at anybody. The most dangerous thing here is the shrimp." A wet giggle on the line, which was what he'd been after. "I'm gonna be home tomorrow. I'm gonna be home before you finish your cereal." Okay. A pause. "Daddy, are the people there being nice to you?" And that was the thing about a sharp kid. She could reach across 100 miles and put her finger right on the sore spot without even trying. Ethan looked back across the room at Admiral Carter holding court, laughing big and bright, and about to have the floor drop out from under him. "They will be," Ethan said quietly. "By the end of the night, I think they will be." "Good," Lily said fiercely. "Because if they're not, you tell them my daddy is the best daddy, and also probably the toughest one there, and they should be nice." Ethan had to press his lips together for a second. "I'll tell them, baby, I promise. Now go to sleep for Mrs. Delgado. Say your prayers. I'll see you in the morning." "Say it back." Lily demanded the old ritual, the thing they said every night. "To the moon," Ethan said. "And back," said Lily, and hung up satisfied the way only a 7-year-old who has extracted a promise from her father can be satisfied. Ethan stood there a moment with the dead phone in his hand. "That's your girl?" the old Master Chief asked. "That's my girl. Sounds like she's got some steel in her." "She's got all of it." Ethan slid the phone back into his pocket. "Everything I've got left, it's in her. That's the whole point of me now. That's the whole man." He looked at the old chief. "You understand why I didn't want to come. It's not that I'm ashamed of what I did. It's that I finally got to be somebody simple. I got to be just her dad, not Shadow, not the ghost on the ridge, just the guy who makes her lunch and reads her the chapter and shows up. And I was scared that if I walked back into this world even for one night, it'd reach out and grab me and I'd lose the simple thing. Because the simple thing is the best thing I've ever had." The old man was quiet for a while. When he spoke, his voice was gentler than Ethan had ever heard it. "Son, I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to actually hear it, because I'm old and I don't say things twice anymore." He waited until Ethan looked at him. "You're not going to lose the simple thing. Being honored for who you were doesn't erase who you are. It's not one or the other. That little girl on the phone, she deserves to know someday, when she's old enough, that her daddy isn't just the man who makes the lunches. She deserves to know he's the man 12 other men are alive because of. Not so she can brag on you, so she can understand where her steel comes from. So she knows that quiet and strong aren't opposites. You're not doing this for Carter tonight. You're not even doing it for the men on that team. You're doing it for her. You're leaving her the truth instead of a hole where the truth should be. The way you never got the whole truth about that ridge from anyone either. He tapped the floor with his cane. Don't leave your girl a ghost story. Leave her a father she can be proud of out loud. Men. And that more than anything else that had been said to Ethan all night went all the way in. He thought about Danny Reyes saying, "Tell her," and never finishing the sentence. He thought about all the things left unsaid, all the truths that died on ridges and in valleys, and got buried in classified files and blacked-out reports. All the men who went into the dark and came out changed, and never got to explain to the people they loved what the dark had taken and what it had given. He thought about Lily, someday grown standing in some living room, the way he'd stood in Danny's girl's living room, and someone telling her about her father, and the difference it would make if the story they told her was the whole story, and not a hole shaped like a man. "All right," Ethan said, and his voice was rough. "All right." Across the room, a bell chimed soft and clear, and a voice came over the sound system, asking the guests to please find their seats, that the evening's program would begin shortly. The crowd began to shift and settle, a slow migration toward the round tables, and the chandeliers dimmed by a notch, and a stage at the front of the hall brightened. The old Master Chief straightened up as best his back would let him. "That's the call. Program's starting. Recognition's near the end after the speeches, so you've got time to sit through some windbags first." He put a hand on Ethan's shoulder, and his grip was still strong, as it had been 15 years ago on a very different night. "Sit near the back. Sit where you can see the stage, but they can't all see you. When they call the name, you'll know. Just stand up and walk to the front. Don't rush. Let them look at you. Let every man in this room who spent it wondering who you were finally get to see." His eyes were shining. "And Ethan, when you pass Bill Carter's table, and you will its dead center on your way to that stage, you keep your sleeve down till you're up there. Let the name do its work first, then let the mark finish it. Understand me?" Ethan understood him. He understood exactly. "One more thing," the old man said. And now there was something almost mischievous under the solemnity, the look of a man who'd waited a very long time for a very good thing. "Whatever happens up there, whatever that big loud fool does when it lands on him, you be the man I trained. You be the man on the ridge. You hear me? Not the loudest, the strongest, the one who holds, the one who waits." He squeezed Ethan's shoulder once more and then let go. "Now go sit down. I've got to go find my own seat before my back gives out, and they have to carry me to it." He shuffled off toward the front, leaning on his cane, and Ethan watched him go. This old man who'd spent 10 years of his retirement fighting a mountain of paperwork so that a ghost could have a name, and felt something in his chest that he didn't have a word for and didn't need one. He found a seat at a table near the back next to an empty chair and across from an elderly couple who smiled at him kindly and didn't ask who he was. He sat with his back to the wall out of old habit where he could see the whole room and the stage both. Up front at the center table, Admiral William Carter settled his broad frame into a chair and leaned back and surveyed the hall like a king surveying a banquet held in his honor, utterly at ease, utterly certain of his place in the world. The lights came down. A single spotlight found the podium. A senior officer stepped up to it, tapped the microphone, thanked everyone for coming, and began to talk about honor and sacrifice, and the long thread of service that bound the men and women in the room to one another and to everyone who'd come before. Ethan barely heard it. He sat very still in the dark at the back of the room, his hands folded on the white tablecloth, his sleeves buttoned tight over the mark that 15 years of quiet had never erased, and he waited. He was good at waiting. He was the best there had ever been at waiting. He'd waited 11 hours on a ridge once in the cold, for a moment he prayed would never come, and knew somehow always would. He could wait a little longer for this one. Up at the center table, catching a phrase from the officer at the podium about tonight being a night for finally telling some truths that had waited too long to be told. Admiral William Carter frowned very slightly and shifted in his seat and reached for his water glass, and had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath his polished shoes had already begun silently and irreversibly to open. The speeches ran long, the way speeches always do when important men have a microphone and an audience that can't leave. Ethan sat through them the way he'd sat through 11 hours on a ridge patient, and still his hands folded on the tablecloth, letting the words wash over him without landing. A rear admiral talked about the future of the fleet. A congressman talked about budgets and pretended it was about valor. Somewhere in the middle, dinner was served and cleared, and Ethan ate almost none of it, and the elderly couple across from him made kind small talk that he answered in short, polite pieces. And the whole time, some clock inside him was counting down toward the thing the old Master Chief had promised was coming. Up at the center table, Admiral William Carter was in his element. Ethan could see him from the back of the room, a big silver shape catching the light, leaning to murmur something to the officer beside him that made the whole table laugh. Carter didn't clap for the other speakers so much as tolerate them, the way a headliner tolerates the opening acts. He checked his watch twice. He was, Ethan understood, waiting for his own moment, because a man like Carter always assumed the evening was building toward him. And then the officer at the podium said a thing that changed the temperature of the room. "Before we close tonight," she said, "we have one final recognition. And I'll be honest with you all, it's the reason many of us are really here." She paused, and the paper in her hands trembled just slightly, and Ethan felt the first cold prickle move up the back of his neck. For 15 years, there has been a name missing from one of the proudest stories in this community's history, a name that was classified, a name that some of us fought a very long time to see, declassified. Her eyes lifted from the paper and swept the room. Tonight, by authorization that came down only last month, we are finally able to say that name out loud. The room quieted. Not all at once. In pieces, table by table, as people caught the change in her voice and turned toward the stage. Ethan sat very still. At the center table, Admiral Carter had stopped smiling. He'd gone still too, in a different way, his big hands flat on the tablecloth, his head tilted slightly, the way a man's head tilts when he hears a sound he can't quite place, but that his body remembers. "Many of you know the operation only by its unclassified name," the officer went on. "Silent Harbor." The word went through the room like a current, and it went through Admiral William Carter like a spike. Ethan saw it hit him, saw the big shoulders jerk just slightly, an involuntary thing the man couldn't have stopped if he'd tried. Saw Carter's head come up. 15 years fell off the Admiral's face in a single second, and for that second, he wasn't an admiral at all. He was a filthy, terrified captain in a dark valley, listening to his men die, and the memory had reached up out of the past and grabbed him by the throat, the same way it had grabbed Ethan an hour before. On that night, the officer said, a 12-man team was surrounded, cut off, their communications were down. Air support was too far out to matter. By every measure, they were lost. She looked up. Every man on that team came home. And they came home because of one operator positioned alone on the high ground who made a series of shots that to this day are studied and, frankly, not entirely believed. 11 targets. 4 minutes. In darkness. In wind. At a distance most shooters wouldn't attempt in daylight on a range. A low sound moved through the room, the collective exhale of men and women who knew exactly how hard that was, and had assumed for years it was a legend inflated in the retelling. "He never sought recognition," the officer said. "He never told his story. He left the service quietly not long after, and by every account has spent the years since living a very ordinary and very private life. When we finally located him and told him we wanted to honor him tonight, he asked us not to make a fuss." A small, sad smile. "We're going to make a little fuss anyway, because some debts have to be seen to be paid." Ethan closed his eyes for just a second. That was the old Master Chief's line. The officer was using his exact words. Somewhere in the front rows, an old man with a cane was sitting very straight in his chair, and Ethan didn't have to see him to know it. Inside the community, the officer said, he was known by a single name, a call sign. For 15 years, it was the only name any of us had for him. She paused. Shadow. And the room came apart at the seams. It wasn't loud. That was the strange thing. It wasn't a roar. It was a wave of sharply indrawn breath and low exclamations and the scrape of chairs, as men who'd heard that call sign, whispered for 15 years, turned in their seats to look at one another to confirm they'd heard it right. Shadow. The ghost had a name coming. At the center table, Admiral Carter had gone the color of the tablecloth. His mouth had come slightly open. He was staring at the stage with an expression Ethan had never seen on the man's face before and would never forget, raw, stripped 15 years of a debt he'd carried in his chest suddenly rising to the surface and choking him. Please, the officer said, and her voice caught, and she had to clear her throat and start again. Please, help me welcome out of the shadows at last. And Ethan Walker stood up. He did it before she said the name. He stood up quietly at his table in the back, and the movement caught the light and caught eyes the way any movement does in a room that's gone dead still, and heads began to turn toward him, and the officer at the podium saw him rise, and her composure finally broke, and her hand came up to her mouth. Petty Officer Ethan Walker. She finished barely above a whisper, and the microphone carried it to every corner of the silent room. For one heartbeat, nobody moved. Then Ethan began to walk toward the stage. He walked the way the old man had told him to. Not fast, not slow. He didn't rush and he didn't preen. He walked down the center aisle between the round tables with his hands loose at his sides and his back straight and his sleeves buttoned. A plain man in a plain navy suit, and the room turned to follow him as he passed, face after face after face, lifting toward him, and the silence that moved with him was the loudest thing Ethan had ever heard. He passed a table where a gray-haired man had risen unsteadily to his feet, gripping the chair back, and Ethan realized as he passed that the man was weeping openly, and didn't care who saw, and Ethan understood without being told that this was one of the 12. One of the men from the valley, alive and old now, and standing to honor the ghost that had kept him breathing. Ethan slowed for half a step and met the man's eyes and gave him one small nod, and the man pressed his fist to his mouth and nodded back. And that was a whole conversation, and it was enough. He passed the Commander Ramirez's daughter, who had both hands pressed flat over her heart, and tears running freely down her face, and she mouthed something at him that he thought was thank you and might have been my father. And either way, it landed in the same deep place, and he carried it with him up the aisle. And then he reached the center of the room and the center table and Admiral William Carter. Ethan didn't stop. The old man had told him not to. But he slowed half a step, the way he had for the weeping veteran, and he turned his head, and he looked Admiral William Carter dead in the eyes for the first time as an equal, and he let the man look back. Carter was on his feet. Ethan hadn't seen him stand. The big man was up out of his chair with one hand braced on the table, like he needed it to stay upright, and his face had come completely undone. Every piece of the arrogance from an hour ago was gone, wiped clean off. And what was underneath it was something almost unbearable to look at: recognition and horror and the dawning, drowning understanding of exactly what he had done. Because Carter got there fast. Ethan watched him get there. Watch the man's mind race back an hour to the corner of the room to the plane. Fellow in the cheap suit, to the words come out of his own mouth. You look like a man who fixes the equipment you're standing on. They're graves every time you use that word. There's a difference between the men who serve the mission and the men who are the mission watched. All of it come back on Carter at once and hit him like the 11 shots had hit those men in the valley, one after another, silent and sourceless and impossible to stop. Carter's mouth moved. No sound came out. Ethan held his eyes for one more second. He didn't sneer. He didn't gloat. He didn't say a word. He just let the man see him see the whole of him, the quiet and the steel both, and then he turned his head forward again and kept walking up the 3 steps and onto the stage into the light. The officer at the podium was struggling to keep her composure. She reached out and shook his hand with both of hers and leaned close to the microphone and said, "Petty Officer Walker, on behalf of a grateful Navy, and on behalf of 12 men who are alive tonight, we—" And that was when the first of them started to stand. It began at the front, near the stage, with the weeping veteran Ethan had passed, who pushed himself all the way up out of his chair and stood at attention, swaying his old body, remembering how, and brought his hand up in a salute that shook. And then the commander stood. And then at a table near the wall, 3 more men Ethan didn't recognize, but who clearly recognized what he was got to their feet. And then it moved. It moved through the room like the collapse of the ambush had moved through the valley, one to the next, to the next. A wave of people, rising chairs, scraping back until the whole hall was on its feet. And the only sound was the rustle of hundreds of people standing, and then the terrible, beautiful silence of a room full of warriors holding a salute for a man who had spent 15 years asking to be left alone. Ethan stood on the stage in the light and looked out at them and felt his throat close. He had not wanted this. He had genuinely, truly not wanted this. But standing there looking at the raised hands and the wet faces and the old veteran shaking at the front, he understood at last what the old Master Chief had been trying to tell him. This wasn't for him. This was for them. These people needed to give this. They'd been carrying it 15 years, the not knowing, the debt with no face. And now the face was here, and they could finally set the weight down. And denying them, that would have been its own kind of cruelty. So Ethan Walker, who hated attention, who had spent his whole career being the man nobody remembered, stood in the light and let a room full of strangers thank him. It was the hardest thing he'd done in 15 years. It was harder than the ridge. On the ridge, he'd only had to be still. Here, he had to be seen. And down in the middle of the room, one man had not raised his hand. Ethan saw him. Of course he saw him. Ethan saw everything. Admiral William Carter stood frozen at the center table on his feet like everyone else, but his hand had not come up in a salute. It hung at his side, and his face was a wreck. He was staring up at the stage at the man he'd humiliated, and Ethan could see him drowning, could see the war going on inside him, the pride and the shame and the 15 years of a story he'd told about himself all crashing into each other at once. The officer at the podium was still talking, saying something about a commendation, about a citation being entered into the record, but Ethan wasn't fully hearing it, because he was watching Carter, and Carter was coming apart. And then into the held silence of that saluting room, Admiral William Carter did something that Ethan had not expected and would think about for a long time afterward. He spoke. "It was you." He said it too loud. The words torn out of him, cracking in the middle, and they carried across the silent hall and stopped the officer at the podium mid-sentence. Every head that had been turned toward the stage now swiveled toward the center table, toward the big silver-haired admiral standing there with his hand not raised and his face falling apart. "It was you," Carter said again, and his voice broke fully. This time all the parade ground boom gone out of it, and what was left was just a man. "On the ridge, it was you." Ethan looked down at him from the stage. The whole room was frozen, caught between the two of them, the ghost in the light, and the Admiral in the dark. "Yes, sir," Ethan said quietly. The microphone caught it. "It was me." A sound came out of Carter, then that Ethan had heard before, from other men, in other terrible moments. A low, broken sound that a strong man makes when something inside him that he's been holding rigid for years finally gives way. Carter's hand came up to his own mouth. His eyes had filled. 15 years of wanting to shake a stranger's hand and never being able to. 15 years of telling the story with a hole in the middle of it. 15 years of survival's guilt and survival's gratitude all tangled together. And now the man who'd made it possible was standing 30 feet away, and the last thing Carter had said to him an hour ago was that he was standing on the graves of better men. "An hour ago," Carter said, and he was speaking to the whole room now, or maybe to no one, maybe just to the terrible truth of it. "An hour ago, I told this man he didn't belong here. He laughed a wet, awful, self-lacerating laugh. I told him he looked like a man who fixes the equipment. I told him he hadn't earned the right to call himself an operator. His voice climbed and cracked. I told the man who saved my life that he was standing on the graves of better men. The room was utterly silent. Nobody moved. Even the officer at the podium had gone still, understanding that whatever was happening now was bigger than her program. I have told the story of that night 1,000 times, Carter said. He wasn't performing now. There was nothing left in him to perform with. 1,000 times. And I always said the same thing. I said I would give anything to shake that man's hand. I would give anything to say thank you. He looked up at Ethan, and the tears were running down his face now openly, this enormous, proud man weeping in front of everyone he'd ever tried to impress. And tonight, God put him right in front of me. Right in front of me, and I spit on him. I looked at the man I've been praying to thank for 15 years, and because he was quiet, and because he was plain, and because he didn't wear his glory where I could see it, I spit on him. Ethan stood very still on the stage. I don't... Carter's voice failed. He tried again. I don't have the right to salute you. A salute is for men who a salute has to be... He couldn't finish. His hand twitched at his side, wanting to come up, and he wouldn't let it, because in his own crashing sense of the thing, he'd decided he hadn't earned the right to render it, and that, more than the tears, was what told Ethan the man was breaking all the way down to something real. And here was the moment. Ethan felt it. The whole room felt it. This was the moment where the ghost could have his due. Where Ethan Walker could stand in the light and let the big loud man grovel, could let the humiliation Carter had handed him an hour ago come flooding back the other direction with interest. The room would have allowed it. Half the room would have cheered it. 15 years of the loudest men getting the glory, while the strongest men got the silence, all of it could have been answered right here, right now, and no one would have blamed Ethan Walker one bit. But Ethan thought about a little girl on the phone saying, "You tell them my daddy is the best daddy, and also probably the toughest one there." He thought about the old Master Chief saying, "Be the man on the ridge, not the loudest. The strongest, the one who holds." He thought about Danny Reyes, who died, so that some of these men could grow into the flawed and prideful and human beings they'd become, and who would not have wanted his sacrifice to end in one more man being made small in front of a crowd. So Ethan did the thing that was harder than the ridge and harder than being seen. He was kind. "Admiral," he said. His voice was steady, and it carried, and it wasn't cold. "You can put your hand down. You don't have to salute me." Carter looked up at him, wrecked, uncomprehending. "You want to know the truth about that night," Ethan said. And he was talking to Carter now, but the whole room was leaning in to hear it, hundreds of people holding their breath. "You keep telling everyone I saved your life, and I appreciate that. But you've got it a little bit wrong, and I've let you have it wrong for 15 years because I wasn't around to correct it." He paused. "I didn't save your life, Admiral. I gave you a chance. That's all a man on a ridge can ever do. He can clear a lane. He can buy a few seconds, but he can't make a man use them." Ethan's eyes moved out over the room, over the 12 men, and the daughters of the 12 men, and all the officers who'd laughed an hour ago. "You want to know what I actually saw through that scope? I saw 11 enemy shooters, sure. But I also saw one American who, when I cleared him a path to run, turned around and went back for a wounded man, one-handed. Dragging a body through open ground with rounds coming in from every side, firing a pistol he couldn't aim at targets he couldn't see." Ethan looked back down at Carter. "That was you, sir. I didn't know your name, but I knew what I was looking at. I was looking at a man who would not leave another man behind, not even to save himself. And I thought I remember thinking it clear as anything, I thought keep that one alive. That one's worth the shots." Carter had both hands over his face now. His shoulders were shaking. "So don't stand there and tell me you didn't earn your salute," Ethan said, and his voice had gone rough at the edges despite everything. "I didn't keep a coward alive that night. I kept a man alive who went back for his brother. Whatever you said to me an hour ago, I've been called worse by better, and I've been called better by worse, and none of it ever meant much to me. But what you did in that valley when you thought no one would ever know your name either, that meant something. That's the truth of that night. Not my 11 shots. Your one refusal to run." He let that sit for a second. "So put your hand down, Admiral. We're square. We've been square for 15 years. You just didn't know it." For a long moment, Admiral William Carter stood there with his hands over his face, and his whole enormous frame shaking, and the room stood frozen around him, and nobody breathed. And then Carter lowered his hands. His face was ruined, wet and red, and stripped of every ounce of the pride he'd walked in with. But his eyes, when they found Ethan's, were clear. "No," Carter said. The word landed hard in the silence. "No," he said again, and his voice was finding its strength, but it was a different strength now, a smaller and truer one. "You gave me a speech to let me off the hook, son, and it was a good one, and I'll carry it the rest of my life. But I know what I did an hour ago, and a man like me doesn't get to be forgiven quite that easy, and doesn't get to skip the part where he pays for it. So you can tell me to put my hand down all you want." He swallowed. "But I'm going to render this salute, and you're going to have to just stand there and take it, because it's the only thing I've got that's worth a damn, and I owe it to you 15 years overdue." And Admiral William Carter decorated SEAL 3 stars on his shoulder, the biggest and the loudest man in every room he'd ever walked into, brought his hand up slow and steady in front of 500 people, and held a salute for a single father in a cheap Navy suit that he had mocked 1 hour before. His hand did not shake this time. The room, which had been holding one breath together for what felt like an age, let it out all at once, and then somebody started to clap, and then everybody was clapping, and it built and built into something that shook the chandeliers, and men who'd been saluting dropped their hands to applaud, and some of them were shouting now, and some of them were crying, and the whole hall was on its feet, making a sound like a storm coming in off the water. And up on the stage in the light, he'd never wanted Ethan. Walker looked down at the weeping Admiral holding a rock-steady salute, and he did the only thing left that a man could do. He brought his own hand up, and he returned it. Ghost to survivor, ridge to valley. The man who cleared the lane and the man who wouldn't run, saluting each other across 15 years and 30 feet, and everything that had happened in between. And it was in that exact moment, with his arm raised and the room roaring, and the old Master Chief somewhere down front, finally getting to see the debt paid. In the light, it was in that exact moment that Ethan Walker's sleeve, the sleeve he'd kept buttoned tight all night long, slipped back from his raised wrist by 2 inches. And the mark came into the light. The officer at the podium was the closest. She saw it first. Ethan watched her eyes drop to his forearm and go wide, watched the breath stop in her throat, and he knew, with a sinking certainty, that the night was not over. That there was one more truth in the room that hadn't landed yet. Because the men in this hall knew what a shadow was, and they knew about the 11 shots, and they thought they finally had the whole story. They didn't. The mark on Ethan's forearm said so. And the officer at the podium staring at it went pale as she began to understand that the legend they'd all just honored wasn't even the half of it. The officer at the podium couldn't take her eyes off Ethan's forearm, and Ethan knew he had to get his hand down and his sleeve back before the whole room caught what she'd caught. He lowered his arm, but it was already too late because she had leaned toward the microphone without meaning to, and the words came out of her before she could stop them. "That's not—" She caught herself. Her professional composure fought to reassert itself and lost. "Petty Officer Walker, your arm." The applause, which had been dying down on its own, cut off entirely. Ethan stood very still. He'd spent 15 years keeping that mark covered, not out of shame, but out of something harder to explain, something that had to do with Danny Reyes, and with a promise, and with a part of the truth he'd never told a living soul. And now, a room full of the most observant people in the United States military was staring at his wrist, and the officer beside him had gone the color of paper. "I think," the officer said slowly into the microphone, her eyes still fixed on his arm, that there may be a part of this story that even I didn't know, and I've read the file 3 times. She looked up at his face. May I? Ethan understood what she was asking. She was asking him to show them, to roll the sleeve back the rest of the way on purpose, in the light in front of everyone. And every instinct he had told him to button the cuff and walk off that stage and get in his truck and drive home to his daughter and take the last piece of that night to his grave the way he'd always planned to. But down in the front row, an old man with a cane was watching him. And Ethan thought about what the old Master Chief had said about not leaving your girl a ghost story about leaving her a father she could be proud of out loud. And he thought about how a half-told truth was its own kind of lie, and how he was tired, so tired of the weight of the part he'd never said. So Ethan Walker reached across his body, and he unbuttoned the cuff of his left sleeve, and he rolled it back. The mark ran up the inside of his forearm. It was old ink, faded blue-black, done by hand, in a place with no proper equipment. To most of the room, it would have looked like a simple sniper's emblem, the kind of thing a lot of shooters wore. But there were men in that hall who knew better, who leaned forward and squinted, and then sat back sharply as they registered what they were looking at, because it wasn't just an emblem. Below the crossed reticle, there was a small line of numbers and a name. And it was the name that made the officer's hand come up to her mouth. Reyes. She read barely audible, and the microphone carried it anyway. Danny Reyes, Ethan said. He hadn't planned to speak. He'd planned at most to show them the mark and let them make of it what they would. But the name came out of him, and once it was out, the rest of it started to come to 15 years of it, and he found he couldn't stop it and didn't want to. There were 2 of us on that ridge, Ethan said. His voice was quiet, but the room was so silent now that it reached every corner. Everybody always talks about the shooter, the 11 shots. Shadow. He shook his head slowly. There's no such thing as a sniper. Not really. There's a shooting team. There's a man on the gun, and there's a man on the glass, and the man on the glass is the one who actually wins the fight. He reads the wind. He reads the range. He spots the targets. He does the math the shooter doesn't have time to do. The shooter just pulls the trigger. The spotter is the one who tells him where to point it. Ethan's throat worked. My spotter was a 26-year-old kid from a town outside El Paso named Danny Reyes. And every single one of those 11 shots everybody's been calling impossible for 15 years, Danny called every one of them. I pulled the trigger. But Danny won that fight. Not me. The room was frozen. At the center table, Admiral Carter had lowered himself slowly back into his chair. His ruined face lifted toward the stage, listening the way a man listens when he realizes the story he thought he knew has a whole floor beneath it he never saw. Danny talked the whole way up that ridge, Ethan said, and something in his voice had changed, gone somewhere far off. About his girl back home, about the ring he was saving for, about his uncle's diner and the green chili that'd take the roof off your mouth. I let him talk. You let a man talk on the way in. He paused. And when the radio started screaming down in that valley, and I hesitated, and I did hesitate, I've never told anyone that. But I did for about 3 seconds. I lay there and did the math on my own life instead of theirs, because I had a wife at home and a letter in my pocket that said I was about to be a father. When I hesitated, it was Danny who looked at me. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me. And that look asked me what kind of man I was going to be. Ethan's jaw tightened. So I put my eye back on the scope, and I said, give me a wind call. And Danny gave it to me, and we went to work. Nobody in that hall was breathing. We knew what firing meant, Ethan said. The second I pulled that trigger, we stopped being ghosts and started being targets. Danny knew it same as I did. I told him, I said, whatever happens after this, you did good work tonight. And you know what that kid said to me? A rough, broken, almost laugh. He said, don't say goodbye stuff, just shoot. Ethan's eyes had gone bright. So I shot. 11 times. And every time Danny's voice was in my ear, calm as a Sunday morning, telling me exactly where to send it. Hold 1/2 mil left. Winds picking up, favor the right edge. Next target, the one by the wall, he's about to flank your friendlies. That was Danny. That whole impossible 4 minutes everybody's been telling stories about that was a 26-year-old kid doing math in his head faster than any man I ever served with while the world came apart around us. Ethan stopped. He had to. The next part was the part he'd never said out loud, not once in 15 years. Not to the Navy, not to a counselor, not to Sarah, not to anyone. The officer at the podium waited. The whole room waited. And down in the front, the old Master Chief had bowed his head because he was the one man in the hall who already knew what was coming, who'd read the unredacted file, who'd carried this piece of it alongside Ethan for 15 years and never once spoken it because it wasn't his to speak. "When the shooting was done," Ethan said, and his voice had dropped to almost nothing, "and your team was moving to the extraction and the birds were coming in. There were a handful of them that peeled off from the valley and came up the ridge after us, just like I knew they might, just like I'd been afraid of when I hesitated." He drew a breath. "We heard them before we saw them, boots on the rocks, and it turned into the close kind of fight, the kind you never want in the dark, and Danny and I, we handled it. We won." He stopped. "But Danny took a round in the last 10 seconds of it, low in the side, and by the time I got him turned over and got my hands on it, I already knew. I've seen enough of them to know." The silence in the room had a weight to it now, a physical pressure. "He was awake," Ethan said. "At the end, he looked up at me and he said one thing. He said, 'Tell her.'" Ethan's voice cracked clean in half on the word. "Tell her." And then he was gone. And I never found out how that sentence was supposed to finish. Tell her what? Tell his girl what? That he loved her. That he was scared. That he was thinking of her. I didn't know. I've never known. 15 years, and I still lie awake some nights trying to finish that sentence for him. Somewhere in the room, a woman was crying, more than one. "I went to see her when I got home," Ethan said. His girl. "I sat in her mother's living room with my hat in my hands, and I told her Danny died brave and died thinking of her. And maybe that was even true. But it wasn't his words. It was mine. I put my words in a dead man's mouth because I couldn't stand to tell her that the last thing he said was a sentence with no end on it." He looked down at the mark on his arm. "I got this a month later. Same emblem the community gives its shooters. But I had them put his name under it. And the date. Because everybody was going to remember Shadow. Everybody was going to remember the 11 shots. And I couldn't stand the thought of the world remembering the trigger and forgetting the kid who actually won the fight. So I carried him, right here, for 15 years, where I'd see him every single morning." Ethan's voice steadied into something hard and final. "That's why I never told the story. Not because I'm humble. People keep calling me humble all night, and it's not that. It's that I couldn't tell the story of that ridge without telling Danny's part, and I couldn't tell Danny's part without telling how it ended, and I wasn't strong enough to say it out loud. Not for 15 years. He lifted his eyes to the room. "So there it is, the whole thing. The part that was in the file and the part that never was. Shadow was 2 men. And the better one didn't come home." For a long moment, no one in that enormous hall moved or spoke. And then at the center table, Admiral William Carter stood up again, slowly. His face was wet and open and utterly changed from the man who'd walked in that evening. And when he spoke, his voice was thick, but it carried. "What was his rank?" Carter asked. Ethan looked at him. "He was a petty officer 2nd class, same as I was." "And his full name?" "Daniel Reyes, Danny." Carter nodded slowly, and then he turned not to the stage, but to the room, to the 500 officers and admirals and dignitaries, and he raised his voice to the parade ground boom that Ethan had heard him use to mock a stranger an hour before. Except now, it was bent to something else entirely. "There's a man in this story who's not here tonight," Carter said. "There's a 26-year-old petty officer named Daniel Reyes, who did the math that kept 12 of us alive, and who took a round on that ridge so that the rest of us could grow old and get fat and wear stars on our shoulders and stand around at dinners like this one, telling stories about ourselves." His voice shook, but he pushed through it. "I have stood up at 100 of these dinners and told the story of Silent Harbor. And I have never once said his name because I never knew it. None of us knew it. He has been dead 15 years, and not one of us has ever said his name out loud in a room like this. He drew a breath. So we're going to say it now. Every man in here who came home from something because somebody else didn't, and that's most of us, isn't it? You're going to stand up. And we are going to remember Petty Officer Daniel Reyes the way this whole community should have remembered him 15 years ago. And Admiral Carter came to attention, and this time the salute he raised was not for Ethan. It was for the empty air. For a kid from El Paso who never made it off a ridge. For the man on the glass who won the fight and got forgotten. And all across that vast hall, 500 people rose to their feet, and 500 hands came up, and the room held a salute in absolute silence for a 26-year-old who'd been gone 15 years and had just finally, in front of everyone, been given his name back. Ethan stood on the stage and watched a room full of the most powerful men in the Navy salute the memory of his spotter, and something that had been clenched shut in his chest for 15 years came loose all at once, and he had to press the back of his hand to his mouth to keep from making a sound. He'd carried Danny alone for so long. Alone on the ridge, alone in the living room with the hat in his hands, alone every morning looking at the ink on his arm. And now, for the first time, he wasn't carrying him alone. The whole room had reached out and taken part of the weight, and Ethan hadn't known until this exact second how badly he'd needed someone to. When the salute finally came down, the officer at the podium stepped forward, wiping her eyes, and did something that wasn't in the program. She turned to Ethan. "Petty Officer Walker," she said, "the citation we prepared tonight was for one man. But I don't think it should be, and I don't think anyone in this room thinks it should be." She looked out at the crowd and got a low rumble of agreement that grew as it went. "So with the authority I've got, and the paperwork I'll fight for starting Monday morning, the way a certain stubborn Master Chief taught me to, I'm going to see to it that Petty Officer Daniel Reyes receives the recognition he earned on that ridge. Posthumously, by name, in the record, forever." She looked back at Ethan. It's 15 years late, but it's going to be his. And down in the front row, the old Master Chief finally lifted his bowed head, and there were tears cutting down the deep folds of his old face, and he was smiling because this right here was the thing he'd spent 10 years of paperwork and every favor he had left fighting for, and He'd always known that if he could just get Ethan into that room, the rest of the truth would come out on its own and finish the job he'd started. Ethan found the old man's eyes across the room, and he understood something then that he hadn't fully grasped before. The old Master Chief hadn't fought all those years just to honor Shadow. He'd fought to give Ethan a room big enough and safe enough to finally set Danny down in. He'd known Ethan would never say it in a quiet office, but in front of 500 witnesses with a saluting room and an admiral's tears, there and only there, might a man like Ethan Walker finally be strong enough to speak the thing that had been killing him softly for 15 years. The old man had known. He'd known the whole time. Ethan mouthed 2 words at him across the hall. "Thank you." And the old Master Chief nodded and pressed his weathered hand flat against his own heart. And that was a whole conversation too. The last one in a 15-year friendship built on things that didn't need saying, and it was enough. Then Admiral Carter was moving. He came out from behind the center table, and he walked toward the stage, and the crowd parted for him the way it always had. Except this time, he wasn't walking like a king. He came up the 3 steps slowly, and he crossed to where Ethan stood. And up close, his face was an old man's face, stripped of all its armor, and his eyes were red. "I don't have the words," Carter said low, just between the two of them now, though the microphone still caught the edges of it. "For what I said to you an hour ago. There aren't words for it. I've been trying to find them since the second she said your name, and I'm not going to find them because they don't exist." "Admiral, let me finish, please," an old man's asking. Carter's jaw worked. "I built my whole life on that night. You understand? Every promotion, every star, every time I stood up at a podium, it all sat on top of the story of Silent Harbor. The night I survived, and I let myself believe somewhere along the way that surviving it made me somebody. That I'd earned all this because I was the kind of man who walks out of a valley like that." He shook his head. "And the truth? The truth I've spent 15 years not looking at square is that I didn't earn my way out of that valley. 2 kids on a ridge gave it to me, one of them standing in front of me, and I called him a radio fixer, and the other one's been dead for 15 years, and I never even knew his name. His voice broke again. I'm 70 years old. I've got maybe a good 10 years left. And I have wasted so much of the time I was given being certain I was the biggest thing in every room. When the whole time, the biggest thing in the room was usually the quietest man in it, and I was too busy being loud to ever see him. Ethan was quiet for the moment, then he said gently, "You saw Danny tonight. You gave him his name back in front of 500 people. That's not nothing, Admiral. That's about the biggest thing a man can do." It's 15 years late. Most of the important things are. Ethan almost smiled. You went back for a wounded man in that valley when you could have run. And you stood up in this room tonight and went back for a dead one when you could have let it lie. That's twice now I've watched you refuse to leave a man behind. Turns out you're consistent, sir. Carter made a sound that was half a laugh and half a sob, and he reached out and gripped Ethan's shoulder hard, the way men do when the thing they feel is too big to say. And Ethan let him. And the 2 of them stood there on the stage. The loud man and the quiet man. The survivor and the shooter, joined across 15 years by a kid from El Paso who'd made both of their lives possible and gotten to keep neither. And then, Carter's eyes dropped to the mark on Ethan's forearm one more time, to the name and the date under the emblem. And he did the last thing. The thing that told Ethan the change in him was real, and not just the emotion of the moment. He came to attention, and he saluted the tattoo. He saluted the name inked on a living man's arm, the memorial a grieving shooter had carried on his own skin for 15 years, and he held it ramrod straight, a 3-star admiral rendering honors to a dead petty officer's name, written on the arm of a man he'd called a nobody. Petty Officer Reyes. Carter said, his voice steady now, steadier than it had been all night. It is the honor of my life to finally know your name. And Ethan Walker, standing in a light he'd never wanted, in a room full of people who'd never forget this night, as long as they lived, looked down at the Admiral saluting his best friend's name on his arm, and found that after 15 years of carrying Danny Reyes entirely alone, he was at long last no longer the only one who remembered. Out in the hall past the doors, a phone was ringing at the coat check, and a young petty officer was hurrying up the aisle toward the stage with an expression that said something had happened, something urgent. And the officer at the podium turned to meet him, and the young man leaned in and whispered something in her ear that made her go completely still. The officer at the podium listened to whatever the young petty officer whispered, and her face changed, and she turned back to the microphone with a look that made the whole room go quiet again. Petty Officer Walker, she said carefully, there's a phone call for you at the front desk. The caller says it's about your daughter. Every ounce of the night drained out of Ethan in a single instant. The stage, the lights, the salute, the tears, all of it vanished, and there was only one word in his entire body, and it was Lily. He was already moving, already off the stage, taking the 3 steps in one, and the crowd was parting for him now, not out of reverence, but out of the instinct people have when they see a father moving toward his child in fear. Ethan! It was Carter right behind him, moving faster than a 70-year-old man had any business moving. Whatever it is, you're not driving 100 miles alone. My car's out front. My driver's the best on the base. Go. I'm with you. Ethan didn't argue. He hit the front desk and grabbed the phone and set his name into it, and Mrs. Delgado's voice came through high and frightened, and the bottom fell out of the world. Ethan? Thank God I've been trying. She's okay. She's okay. I need you to hear that first. She's okay, but she woke up and she couldn't breathe right. She was wheezing, and it got worse fast, and I didn't want to wait. So I called the ambulance, and we're at County General now, and they've got her on a breathing treatment, and they're saying it's her asthma, but it's bad. Ethan, it came on so fast, and she keeps asking for you. Put her on. Ethan's voice came out flat and dead level, the ridge voice, the voice that only showed up when everything inside him was screaming. If she's awake, put her on the phone. There was a shuffle, and then a small voice, thin and scraped raw, fighting for each word around a chest that wouldn't open all the way. "Daddy? I'm here, baby. I'm right here. I can't breathe good." I know, sweetheart. Listen to me. Listen to my voice." And Ethan, standing in the marble lobby of that grand hall with an Admiral at his shoulder, and his own heart trying to climb out of his throat, made his voice go slow and warm and certain, because his daughter needed steady more than she needed anything else in the world, and steady was the one thing he'd always been able to give her. "You remember what we practice. When the air gets tight, you blow out slow like you're blowing on soup, long and slow, not big breaths in, slow breaths out. Can you do that for me?" A wet, whistling attempt. "That's it. That's my girl, again. Blow on the soup." He closed his eyes. "I'm coming right now. You hear me? I'm getting in a car this second, and I'm coming, and I'm gonna be there so fast. You just keep blowing on the soup and let the doctors help you, and I'm gonna be there. To the moon, baby." And back. She managed barely, and it came out broken, but she said it, and Ethan held on to those two words like a rope over a drop. "Give the phone back to Mrs. Delgado. I love you. I'm coming." Mrs. Delgado came back on, and Ethan got the hospital, the unit, the room, and then Carter's hand was on his back, steering him toward the doors, and Carter was barking orders at his driver. And somewhere behind them, the old Master Chief was calling out that he'd handle everything here. "Just go, son, go." The drive should have taken 2 hours. Carter's driver did it in a shade over one running lights with a base placard on the dash. And the whole way Carter sat beside Ethan in the dark of the back seat, and did the thing that surprised Ethan most of all, that entire surprising night. He didn't fill the silence. He didn't make it about himself. He didn't try to soothe it away with talk. He just sat there, solid and present, a big old man who understood that sometimes the only thing you can give a frightened father is your silent company and the reassurance of not being alone. Once about halfway, he said quietly, "My youngest had asthma, bad when she was small. I know this fear. It doesn't help to hear it, but you're not the first father to make this drive, and she is going to be all right, because they always are, because kids are tougher than the whole Navy put together." And then he went quiet again, and let Ethan stare out the window and pray. They made the hospital at midnight. midnight. Ethan was out of the car before it fully stopped through the doors down the corridor, and then he was in the doorway of a small bright room, and there was Lily propped up in a bed that swallowed her a mask over her small face. But her eyes were open and her color was back, and when she saw him, her whole body strained toward him. "Daddy?" He crossed the room in 2 strides and had her in his arms, mask and tubes and all, careful and desperate at once, and she buried her face in his neck, and he felt her breathing, actually breathing ragged, still but real, and he held on to that like it was the only true thing in the universe. "I got you," he said into her hair over and over. "I got you. I'm here. I got you." "You came so fast," she whispered. "I told you I would." "Were the people nice to you?" "At the dinner." And even now, even in a hospital bed at midnight with an oxygen mask on her face. His daughter's first real question was about whether the world had been kind to her father, and Ethan had to squeeze his eyes shut against the flood of it. "They were baby," he said. "They were real nice, in the end." A doctor came in and explained it in the calm, careful way they do, that it had been a serious flare, but they'd caught it in time, that the treatment had worked, that they wanted to keep her overnight to watch her, but that she was out of the woods and she was going to be just fine. And Ethan sat on the edge of the bed with his daughter tucked against him, and felt 15 years of held-together strength finally quietly come apart, not in front of 500 people in a grand hall, but here in a small hospital room, over the one thing that had ever really mattered. It was only after Lily had drifted off, her breathing evened out into something soft and regular, that Ethan looked up and saw Admiral William Carter standing in the doorway, hat in his hands hanging back, unwilling to intrude. Ethan eased himself off the bed and stepped into the hall. "She's okay," Ethan said. "They're keeping her overnight, but she's okay." Carter let out a breath like he'd been holding it the whole drive. "Thank God." You didn't have to come in. You didn't have to do any of this." "Yeah, I did." Carter turned his hat over in his big hands. "Son, an hour before all that started tonight, I looked at you and I saw a man who fixes equipment. And now, I've watched you talk a child through an asthma attack over a phone with a voice like still water. And I've watched you cross a hospital in the time it takes most men to find their keys. And I've watched you hold that little girl like she's the only thing holding you to the earth." He shook his head slowly. "I keep thinking I've understood who you are, and then you show me another floor underneath. On the ridge, in that room, right here in this hallway. There's more man in you than I've got the equipment to measure, and I've been doing this 50 years. Ethan didn't know what to say to that, so he said the truest thing he had. "She's the whole thing, Admiral. Everything I ever did that mattered, the ridge included. None of it's worth what happens in that room right there. That kid. That's the mission now. That's the only one that ever really counted." Carter nodded slowly, and something moved across his weathered face, some private reckoning. "You know what I've got from 50 years of this," he said. "Medals, a wall of them, 3 stars, a reputation, a story I told at dinners." He looked toward the dark room where the little girl slept. "And I'd trade the whole wall right now tonight for a kid who woke up scared and asked for me. I had them, you know, kids, grandkids now. And I was so busy being the biggest thing in every room that I missed most of it. I've got a daughter who's 42 years old, and I could count on 2 hands the number of times I talked to her the way you just talked to yours." His voice roughened. "You think you're the one who got taught a lesson tonight when I said your name. You're wrong. I'm the one who got taught, and I'm too old to fix most of what I broke. But I'm not too old to fix some of it." Starting with a phone call to a 42-year-old woman who's forgotten what her father sounds like when he's not giving orders. And Ethan understood then that the mocking Admiral from the start of the evening was truly gone, and what stood in his place in a hospital hallway at 1 in the morning was just a man, an old one running out of time, and finally awake to it. Lily came home the next afternoon. And the story Ethan had asked them not to, had asked the old Master Chief and the officer and Carter himself to please keep it quiet, but a room like that has 500 phones in it, and there's no keeping anything quiet anymore. The story got out. Somebody had filmed it. Of course, somebody had filmed it. The video went up 3 days later, a shaky vertical clip of an admiral saluting a single father of a plain man, rolling back his sleeve of 500 officers, rising to salute a dead man's name. And it did the thing those videos do. It went everywhere, millions of views in a week. Ethan's phone rang and rang with numbers he didn't know. Reporters, producers, a man who wanted to buy the movie rights, a woman who wanted him on a morning show. He said no to all of it. He said no the way he'd always said no, quietly and completely, and he went back to making Lily's lunches and mowing the strip by the sidewalk and reading her the chapter every night. Because the old Master Chief had been right about a lot of things, but Ethan had been right about one thing too. The simple life was the best thing he'd ever had, and he wasn't going to trade it for a camera, not for anybody. But he did say yes to one thing. 3 months after that night, Ethan Walker drove to a town outside El Paso, Texas, with his daughter buckled in the back seat, and he found a small diner with a hand-painted sign, and he sat down at the counter, and he ordered the green chili that would take the roof off your mouth. And when the old man behind the counter came to check on him, Ethan asked him if he was by any chance related to a young man named Danny Reyes. The old man went very still. "He was my nephew," he said. "He passed. A long time ago. In the service." He studied Ethan's face. "Did you know him?" "I was with him," Ethan said quietly, "on his last day. What happened after that took most of the afternoon, and it involved the diner closing early, and a phone call to a woman who was no longer a grieving girl, but a married mother of 2 in her late 30s, and a long conversation at a corner table that Ethan had waited 15 years to be strong enough to have. He told them the truth. All of it. He told them what Danny did on that ridge, that he was the one who'd really won the fight, that 12 men came home because a 26-year-old from their town did math in his head under fire that no one else could do. He told them about the recognition coming, the citation, the name going into the record forever. And he told the woman the thing he'd never told her 15 years ago in her mother's living room when he'd put his own words in a dead man's mouth because he couldn't bear the truth. "I told you back then that his last words were about you," Ethan said. "And that was kind, but it wasn't honest, and you deserve honest. The truth is, he said 2 words. He said, 'Tell her.' And then he was gone, and I never knew how he meant to finish it. I've carried that 15 years not knowing. Tell her what?" Ethan's throat worked. "But I've had a long time to think about it. And I think I finally understand it. I don't think it mattered what came after. I think tell her was the whole message. I think a man who's dying and thinks of one person and uses his last breath to make sure that person knows he was thinking of them. I don't think the rest of the sentence was ever the point. I think tell her was everything he had left, and he spent it on you. So, he was thinking of you. At the very end, when there was room for only one thought, it was you. That's what he wanted you to know. I'm sorry it took me 15 years to bring it to you." The woman cried, and Danny's uncle cried, and Lily, too young to understand all of it, but old enough to understand that something enormous and tender was happening, climbed into her father's lap and held onto him. And Ethan held her back, and for the first time since a cold night on a ridge 15 years before, the sentence that had haunted him had an ending he could live with. He could live. They put a plaque up in the diner eventually, right by the register where everybody could see it. A photograph of a grinning 26-year-old in uniform, and beneath it, the citation, the real one, the one that finally said his name. Petty Officer Daniel Reyes. And under that, a line the family had chosen themselves. He did the math that brought them home. Ethan went back to visit sometimes. He'd bring Lily. They'd have the green chili. It became a thing they did a couple times a year, a quiet pilgrimage that his daughter came to understand more of as she got older. Until the day came, years down the road, when she was old enough to hear the whole story, and Ethan told it to her, all of it. The ridge and the shots, and the spotter, and the mask over her own face the night it all came out. He told her because the old Master Chief had been right about that too. A child deserves to know where her steel comes from. She deserves to know that quiet and strong were never opposites, that the man who packed her lunches was the same man who lay 11 hours in the cold and held when everyone else would have run. That her father had carried a dead friend on his own skin for 15 years, rather than let the world forget him. And Lily, grown by then, listened to all of it, and when he was done, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said the thing that Ethan would carry with him for the rest of his own life, the way he'd carried Danny, the way he'd carried her. "You know what you did, Dad," she said. "You made sure nobody got left behind. Not on the ridge, not in that room, not Danny, not the Admiral even who didn't deserve it, not me." She took his weathered hand in both of hers. "That's the whole thing about you. You just never leave anybody behind." The old Master Chief passed away 2 winters later in his sleep in Florida after all, and at his funeral, there were more operators than Ethan had ever seen gathered in one place. And Admiral William Carter, retired, now smaller, now softer around the edges, in a way that suited him, stood up and gave the eulogy, and he told the whole crowd that the old man's finest operation, the one he was proudest of, the one that took him 10 years and every favor he had left, was not any mission in any war. It was getting one stubborn ghost into one crowded room so that a dead kid from El Paso could finally have his name said out loud. He spent the last decade of his life, Carter said, making sure that no man who mattered got forgotten. And that's the only kind of glory worth a damn. Not the loud kind. The kind that goes back for the ones who can't speak for themselves. Ethan sat in the second row with a grown Lily beside him, and he thought that was about right. He never did become famous, not the way the world wanted him to. The video faded the way videos do, replaced by the next one and the next. Most people who'd shared it forgot his name inside a month. And that was exactly precisely how Ethan Walker wanted it, because he had learned the truth about that night a long time ago, and it had never once changed. The best operators are the ones nobody remembers. The strongest man in the room is almost never the loudest. And the measure of a life is not the medals on your chest, or the stars on your shoulder, or the story you tell at dinners. It's whether when the radio screams and the easy thing is to stay a ghost, you put your eye back on the scope. It's whether you go back for the wounded man when you could run. It's whether you carry the ones who didn't make it right there on your own skin for as long as it takes until the world is finally ready to remember them with you. Ethan Walker was that kind of man. He always had been. And the quiet single father standing in the corner of that grand hall, the one everybody was so sure didn't belong. He was never the man who fixed the equipment. He was the reason they all came home.